Hello Scrap Academy, this is Laura Rumble and I am going to take you through a bit of an overview of watercolours. I have kids paints, craft paints, professional artists paints and a few other bits and pieces in between, and I'm just going to take you through have a bit of a chat about watercolour. So, where to start? I guess cheap and cheerful, or inexpensive, sorry, be more classy about it. Inexpensive watercolours, you can't really get more inexpensive than this. It's about £1. It's a plastic with poured paints that are dried and comes with a brush. I loathe these brushes. I would definitely recommend buying a nice bristled brush. A student one is fine, you don't need to go for a fancy brush, but something with nice soft bristles for watercolour. These reconstitute with water, so wet brush, and you're ready to paint. Going from that as the cheapest, I guess next we have craft paint. These are both the same brand, Shimmers, and they are water-based colour. Some have shimmer in them. This is a pot that I've put some water in to reconstitute the paint and give that stir up, and that's ready to use as you would any other paint. You can spray these or put a bit out onto a palette and use it with a brush as you would any other paint. You have liquid watercolours. This is from Pink Fresh and comes in a bottle that I can never undo. Right, I'll be back. Alright, some time has passed. These come in with a little eyedropper, and these are super pigmented. Really, for a nice wash of colour, you could probably get 12 by 12 page filled with one drop and water. It is that concentrated. Probably these next. This is a big pan. It's a very technical term. More professional watercolours come in tubes or pans, and it's exactly the same paint. In a tube you can fill your own pans. This is a big pan, this is a half pan, which is what I tend to use, and a whole pan is twice the size of a half pan. If you are doing large backgrounds, a big pan is handy because you can fit a large brush. If you're using a half pan and a large brush, well, you're restricted. So going on what you're going to be doing, if you're just going to be doing large washy backgrounds, I would suggest going for a larger pan. I paint, I watercolour as well as doing scrapbooking, so I've tended to go for just the half pan. You can get all sorts of different finishes. Obviously these are neon and they really pack a punch, as well as pans and tubes. Watercolour also comes in stick form. So again, this is exactly the same paint as you would get if you bought a tube or if you bought a filled pan, but this is in a solid stick form. This is probably the most economical way if you want to buy professional or student grade watercolours. To go for a stick tends to be the cheapest. I started off my watercolour journey, I suppose you'd say, with Winsor & Newton Cotman watercolours. These are student grade watercolours, and really you don't need anything more than this. I upgraded to professional Daniel Smith watercolours because I'm a paint snob, but you could quite easily paint brilliant backgrounds, brilliant pictures. This is everything you'd need for scrapbooking, for sure. Again, you've got tubes and you've got pans, and it's exactly the same paint. This one is solid. You put your wet brush to pick up paint, and these you just squeeze a little bit out, either onto a palette or into a pan. Here I've got just a few colours. I was working on a floral series and squeezed out a dot of each. As you use them up, you can just put an extra dot in. When they're wet like this, you simply take your wet brush to them and it instantly becomes paint. When they're dried like this, you simply take your wet brush to them and they instantly become paint. These can be reconstituted as many times as you need. I'm running out of desk space. You've then also got powdered watercolour. This is Brusho. You can get these many different brands. The Nouveau ones have some shimmer in them, which I do not own, but I do own some shimmer. And if you use them together, you get the same effect. And here's my posh palette, my Daniel Smith watercolours. To be honest, you only need 6 colours. You need red, yellow and blue in both cool and warm shades, and from those 6 paints you should be able to mix every colour. If you're like me, you'll want to have one of every colour anyway. So let's get on to demoing them. I'm going to be demoing on Winsor & Newton Cotman watercolour paper. You can gesso your cardstock and use that. Using watercolour paper is probably a better idea. This paper is built to take water without warping, without peeling, without disintegrating. I am now going to paint a load of leaves, 1 or 2, using each type of watercolour paint that I have, keeping with a minty aqua greeny kind of colour palette, and going up through the grades as we go. So one of the main differences between these inexpensive craft paints and the professional watercolour paints is the amount of pigment versus the amount of filler and binder. So these paints will have a lot more filler and a lot less pigment. Doesn't necessarily matter, it's just a different way of working. You can build up several layers to get a deeper, richer shade. One thing, the cheaper paints, sorry I keep saying cheaper, can sometimes be a bit stingy to start with to release their colour. You can get around that by adding some water to the palette and leaving it to sit for a few minutes before you start painting, and that will soften up and then start releasing the pigment more easily. The other thing to note is that any of these paints will work together. So just there I used some of a shimmery paint with some of a liquid watercolour and mixed them together. They work brilliantly. There I have painted with just clean water and then sprinkled on the watercolour powder. get some really interesting effects by just sprinkling and leaving the water to do its thing. You can also stir them up, mix them together and use them just as a regular paint. You can mix mica or a shimmery, you can even use eyeshadow, shimmery eyeshadow mixed in with the paints to give a shimmery finish. Here I have a piece of white cardstock with a layer of clear gesso, and a piece of white cardstock with white gesso, and a piece of what I've called expensive watercolour paper. It basically just means it's an offcut, and I don't know what brand it is. This hopefully will give you the idea of the way the different surfaces take the paint, what gesso does, what watercolour paper does, and what untreated card does. You can rework the paint if it's on gesso or watercolour paper. With untreated card, it goes into the paper, into the fibres of the paper, and that's pretty much it. You're not going to be able to manipulate it at all. I've got quite a lot of water on the gessoed pieces, and the paper is holding up to that really well. It's not disintegrating, it's not piling. The untreated card piles quite a lot, and again with watercolour paper it's built for water, so you can throw as much at it as you want. Now I thought I was going to use those swatches to die cut some flowers, but I've changed my mind and I'm going to paint some swatches of the neon watercolour and die cut from them instead. I have fussy cut out all of those leaves, die cut some circles and some rings, and a title. I have printed my photo Polaroid style, and I'm going to stick my title to the bottom white space. Photo paper's glossy, and you can sometimes get a bit of slip sliding when you put wet glue on top of that, so I've blotted my adhesive onto a piece of scrap paper first, and that just eliminates the glue splurge. I am only adhering the stem of the leaf, just the very base, and leaving the tops to curl up and give dimension. Adding in my hoops and rings and dots and circles, just popping them in and around, some tucked underneath, some tucked over leaves, and I'm using them in place of flowers, and it's a bit quirky, which is quite me. Adding a few more, and then I realised that my pencil line is a bit too dark. Not much I can do about it because I've got glue over it, so it won't erase. But anyway, I do my best. If you're going to use pencil lines, do them lightly. I've used a little bit of corrugated card behind the photo to bump it up a little bit, moving away from using foam and recycling packaging instead. I've added a subtitle which I cut on my Cameo. I actually cut it out 3 times and stacked them up, so I've got what feels like chipboard now. Quite thick and dimensional and sturdy. I'm tucking in some white leaves. This is a die from Altenew, and I'm just popping them in and around, bulking up and giving some more interest. And there you can see the dimension, all the different watercolour finishes, and my crazy neon goodness. And that's pretty much it. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you have learnt a bit about watercolour. If you have any questions, leave them below and I'll do my best to answer. Thank you very much for watching. Like and subscribe and all that jazz, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!